Greetings, my name is JC from the Gamer's Gaiden, and in this episode I'm going to be doing a retrospective and review for a game that I actually never played as a kid, the original Diablo. So, the original Diablo came out in, December 96, if I understand correctly. Some sources seem to think it came out in January, but I think it had maybe a limited release in December. Irregardless, mid-90s, it was a role-playing game that the way that I knew about it was I had the original Warcraft and Warcraft 2, and there were an advertisement pamphlet in the Warcraft 2 box that actually had a pamphlet with games that were coming out. One of those games being the original Diablo, and it was kind of cool because it looked something like it would be interesting for me to play. Now, at the time, for context, I had a 486. The game was designed for a Pentium, though it could have potentially worked, and I think I had half of the amount of RAM that the game required too. I had 4 megabytes of wanted 8. So I basically couldn't play the game, so I never actually picked it up. And during this time, for role-playing games, I was kind of playing the Super Nintendo, some of the Genesis ones, like action RPGs, and the PlayStation RPGs, such as the Final Fantasies and stuff like that. So this type of RPG I don't think I actually ever had experience with at the time, which I found really intriguing and interesting because it had some screenshots of what the gameplay sort of looked like, and it looked really intriguing to me. And I just always at the time wanted to play the game, but never actually got that chance because I didn't have the adequate hardware, and to be honest, none of my friends had the game either, and the only game in reference to it came out a year later in the same genre, Baldur's Gate, and my one friend at that time had a computer that could run it. They had a P90, and he got Baldur's Gate, and we had played that, and then I remember reading people's opinions about Diablo 1 on forums, and sort of getting reviews in magazines and stuff like that about what the game was like, and it still sounded interesting, but it sort of faded from memory up until the second Diablo came out whenever I was in high school, and a lot more people were playing Diablo 2 instead of Diablo 1. So never really got the experience of playing the original one as it was new, and to be honest, whenever I compare this game to games that sort of came out at the time, it sort of looked inferior to me because it just didn't have as many of the story element beats. As fans of the channel will know, I'm more of a fan of games that have a better narrative in it, and more role-playing game elements to it. And so the game came out as a re-release a year ago on GOG, and I picked it up on day one, and I played it for 20 minutes just to kind of poke around with the game and be able to kind of see if they sort of did a good job with the functionality of being able to run on newer hardware, because if I understand correctly, that was always the reason why the game was never available, is that, and taken off the Blizzard store, is because the game actually didn't and doesn't play well with new hardware. You essentially had to have an old PC lying around if you wanted to run it correctly, because of the way that it just sort of worked with new OSs and stuff like that. And so it just kind of sat there in my GOG library until a couple of weeks ago, and I was kind of in the mood for a role-playing game, but also in the mood for an action game, and I was just sort of scrolling through my games, and I saw Diablo, and I was just like, you want to know what? I did play Diablo 3, which is technically the first Diablo that I played, and I did enjoy it, and I do know that this is sort of a more dark aesthetic to it, and a lot of people have really good memories of the original one, especially the second one, which I might go to later. So I gave it a shot, and I was surprised with how fun I actually found this game to be. And I think the one thing that I sort of neglected to think about whenever I was a kid, which is why I sort of explained why I sort of glossed over this, the one thing that I didn't talk about was its fun factor. Although I will state that all the RPGs that I played instead of Diablo over the years do have that fun factor, but it's just more of, I guess, an action-oriented fun factor. It's hard to explain. It just the loot drops are not as plentiful as Diablo 3. I'm assuming it becomes more and more plentiful and crazy as time goes on, because I do know people like grind characters in 2 and 3 and try and get more and more loot. So I didn't get much loot in my playthrough. There was just like a couple of yellow items and a handful of blue items, and I think even one of my rings was still a white item, to be honest with you. But anyway, the fun factor is the one thing that I think I kind of like was misguided on, and I probably would have gone off to play, because people always sort of tried to explain to me in high school, like, the Diablo series is so great, you can do this and these things happen in the game. The story is sort of very linear and basic in comparison to Baldur's Gate JC, but like you really have to try it, and it was kind of like Morrowind. I never really gave it that much of a chance until much later in life. And kind of regretting it now, I'm going to say that. But I would say that I don't know if it's a game that I would recommend most people go back to. Maybe if you're curious in how the older Diablo series sort of originated, just because its control scheme is a little archaic, and I think people who aren't used to playing games like that or didn't grow up playing games without like a modded interface, then they might have a hard time with it, because from my understanding, like, Diablo 2 adds in a lot of quality of life stuff, and in fact I did look into some mods that were for Diablo 1. There's I guess what I'm to understand is the most famous one, the Beelzebub mod, or the HD Diablo mod, which basically makes Diablo 1 sort of play like Diablo 2 with some enhanced features and unlocking a bunch of hidden content that they just didn't really get to finish and stuff like that, and they sort of cut out due to time. And if I play through it again, I might actually play through with this, because it looks kind of interesting to sort of refresh it beyond just the procedural dungeons. And although, like, I only played through it once, I'm actually playing through it again a second time for a specific reason, which I'll get into in a bit. But I don't think I would really necessarily have been a person who would have replayed the game constantly, because I don't really see a point to it unless I had played the game with friends. Because, like, I always tell people that in the Infinity Engine games, which is like Baldur's Gate, Icewind Dale, one of my favorite ones is actually Icewind Dale, but there's a specific reason as to why, and that's because the experience with friends with that is more of a tailored experience, and you playing online, that a game is designed for you to actually just start with a party instead of adding a whole bunch of NPCs, which are to a story. And in similar to Diablo's fashion, it's more linear and just kind of a game that you can sort of crunch through and be able to play openly with your friends. And if I had played this game with, like, my friend, for example, in middle school, who I played Warcraft 2 with a lot, and I played with him because it worked on both of our computers, which it worked on his but not mine, and he never got it anyway. But regardless, I think we might have played it multiple times then, just to have fun, especially if we understood that the procedural dungeons would sort of make it different. I would say its downsides is really that there's barely any missions, and it's sort of boring in the effect that really you're just doing the same thing over and over again. But I do like the kind of repetitive monotony in doing that in specific types of games, but just, I guess, not constantly, but something I kind of maybe like to go back to. It's kind of like how people go back to a season of a game like Diablo 3, for example. A lot of my friends noticed on Discord, oh, you're playing Diablo like, is that the OG one? Like, are you going to go play Diablo 3? The Season 20 is starting. And I'm like, yeah, maybe I'll come back and I'll play 3 with you for a little bit, and we'll play it for a bit, and then we'll kind of forget about the game. I know Ian's opinion on this is probably a lot different than mine, since he's more of a Diablo fan, since he kind of grew up playing those games, versus like the sort of opposite end of the scale, which sort of are like the Infinity Engine games and stuff like that, or the gold box games and stuff. But yeah, I I really enjoyed the fun factor of this game, and I think that's really what kept me playing this game the most, and what I was kind of the most fascinated by, even though it's very similar to a lot of the tropes of like basic Dungeons and Dragon like archetypes and sort of like old RPGs where it's just sort of reskinning the same monsters and there's not a lot of them. All RPGs do that, but it does it in such a simple and effective manner that you can really tell that there's a huge like labor of love for this game from the developers, because they were trying to make something unique, especially for the time. And there's a game developers conference on YouTube where, from I believe it's from '96, with the creator of the original Diablo talking about his experiences with it, and I watched that whenever I was playing through the game, just to kind of just get some context as to sort of like how they did some of the stuff. Like, it's actually a tile-site game, and there's an argument on whether or not it should be turn-based, kind of like the Fallout or XCOM game, and then the Blizzard told him no, it needs to be real-time, and he totally disagreed, and I thought that was really interesting. And then he realized, like, no, this actually was the right choice whenever he actually implemented it, like, over a night or something like that. And he made it real time, and he's just like, wow, this is insane, that was amazing, because he like clicked on the skeleton or whatever, and it just went over and then crushed the skeleton. It was a really interesting watch. I highly recommend, if you're a Diablo fan, to go watch that. And I'm really curious as to like how this series sort of developed into the third one, because I can sort of see those steps, but there's a gap there, because the MMO influence is definitely huge in the Diablo 3. From what I understand, even talking with like friends who are big fans of the series and stuff like that, and I'm very curious about 2 now, because I've heard that's the best one. And I actually do own a box copy of it sitting around that I bought in a lot of video games that I just never got around to. I'm sorry, Diablo fans. I just kept on playing other like isometric RPGs instead. And I got around to it eventually. But yeah, like I said, it's the fun factor of this game is really cool. The other thing that I would say that I would kind of critique it on, and I think I would have the same critique when I was younger too, is that the difficulty scale is awkward. The best example of this is any boss character seems to be a little bit OP just for the sake of wasting your pots. And I think it's just because the developers might not have necessarily had another way to challenge you other than wasting your potions, whether it be mana or health potions. And I'm watching through a let's play of somebody who played through as a warrior, because I was really interested, because apparently the warrior is the hardest class to play, allegedly. I don't actually know. I can understand that argument, at least, and he's playing through with the HD mod, so I can see all the unlocked content and stuff like that. And he's playing through as a warrior, and it's just really interesting, because he's commented on it a couple times too, where he's had to waste a lot of pots. And if I compare the game to other sort of isometric RPGs, that's a factor, but that's not really the factor. And I'm really curious to see how or if Diablo 2 fixes that. I would hope it's something that they fix, just because that sort of being the mechanic, and then just the loot gap and the experience gap being the only other really like challenge mechanic, it sort of makes it more of a bland RPG to me. And that to me were some of the reasons why, as a kid growing up, that was just like, I'd rather spend my time on some of the other games. And yeah, I found it really interesting had grown up with all of these fans of this game tell me, I had the same thing with Morrowind, and it was like, oh, like, this game is really, really great, and you should play it, it's similar to the other game. And I do recall getting them to play Baldur's Gate and, like, Neverwinter Nights, and they'd be like, whoa, like, no, that's one of the best RPGs I've ever played, but I still, like, really love going back to Diablo 2 again and again. So, like, I think really, and from memory, I think they found sort of the fun factor of being able to have that repeatable process and being able to constantly replay the game. A large factor of that fun, especially if it's like you don't have that many games and you enjoy that mechanic, and there's not very many games, especially like early. Like everybody now talks about, oh, it's just a Diablo clone or it's Diablo influenced or things like that for if it's like a core action RPG. But like before, there wasn't very many of them, so I can definitely see like why that would have been a factor then. But like now, I've looked up like top modern Diablo clones, and I found some really interesting ones. Some of them which I've actually bought and that are on my list to play. One of them being Shadows Awakening, and there is another one, but I can't recall the name of it off the top of my head. It's a Grim Dawn, I think. I'll put a thing here if I'm wrong about the name. But anyway, in Titan Quest is another one that I've played, and I'm like, yeah, I knew it was a Diablo clone, but I've never actually beaten, so maybe I'll play that next. I don't know. I guess in closing, I found the game really fun and interesting to play through. Like I said, would recommend it for any fan of the series who's never actually played the original games. They're available on GOG now. It's definitely not the best role-playing game that I've ever played by far, and I don't think it would have been if I played it at that time in comparison to the other games that I was playing at the time. To try and be as unbiased as possible, and yeah, I'm playing this game late, I get it, like, it's an old game, but, I don't know. The one thing is that, like, I don't normally replay games, but I'm really curious to play through the Hellfire content, and I was able to import my character over, and since it is procedural, I'm more apt. I'm actually already on floor 5 of a second playthrough that's in the Hellfire expansion. None of my items ported over, so I'm kind of trying to like grind through the main game, and it turns out my game seed actually has some of the quests. I've seen 2 of them so far that I didn't play before, because it seems like, based off the Wikia, there's like every so many floors or sets of 3 quests, and it chooses 2 of them for you. And like I didn't get the Leoric quest through my first playthrough, but I have this playthrough, for example. So I'm curious to see if this seed actually has the rest of them too. But the point is I'm gonna go through the dungeon until I feel like I've gotten a good replacement amount of loot, and then go through the Hellfire content, because that has like 8 floors I should be able to play through, and I've also put it on a harder difficulty as well, since I'm able to do that like out of the box without modifying it or using the exploit that I've read about to change the difficulty. So I'm looking forward to see kind of like what the Hellfire content floors are like, because I've noticed some really drastic improvements with the game, such as improved AI. One of the tricks that I was using with the original Diablo, I'm playing through as a sorcerer, sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier. Elf Mage called it, but although it's not an elf, but it is technically a mage anyway, so that's just my shtick. So the firewall spell, you could basically layer it, and then all the enemies in the original Diablo would just walk through to you, generally dying, and if they didn't, you would just basically be able to kite them in circles in order to beat them, and they seem to be just stopping at the wall in their AI script in Hellfire, so it seems to be improved, which I actually am enjoying a lot more. I'm having to utilize spells in different ways, so it's sort of changing the gameplay a lot. And there's new items, and the drops work a little bit differently and stuff like that, such as like the traps, and there's some new spells, and the item drops just seem to be not more plentiful, but just they seem to make a little bit more sense. For example, I've seen a couple more yellow boss or named characters that are in certain sections of the game, which sort of seems to make more sense because it didn't actually happen that often in the OG out of the box Diablo, which is something that the Diablo mod, the HD mod, actually does. So like I said, in a few years' time, whenever like I see myself replaying this in a couple years' time, so I think I'll play it with the HD mod next time, so I can play all those cool unlocked quests and stuff like that. But yeah, so the improvements of Hellfire seem to be really interesting, and I also found it super interesting reading about Hellfire because Blizzard told Blizzard North, if I understand correctly, we want an expansion pack to happen, but they wanted to just work on number two. And they had some ideas for what they would have in number two, and some of the content that they cut in the original ended up into, but modified a little bit. But like an example of some of the interesting facts was that Sierra made Hellfire contracted because it was like a subsidiary or something. But at that time they had like owned the rights to them or something. And then so they made a barbarian class, but their intention was to make the barbarian in Diablo 2. So what they ended up doing was actually telling them, no, you can't do that. So they just stopped it, but it's like a character that you can unlock via making a command code. I'll show you what I had to do. I had to make like a command.txt file to unlock some things, a couple of classes. But yeah, they didn't want them to be able to only the monk was available, and there's never been a monk since. And I know there's a huge divide for like the actual developers and I guess the community, the fans. To my understanding, there was enough backlash for them to actually say, okay, you can release Hellfire with Diablo and GOG. So there must be enough of the Hellfire backers out there in order to warrant like a pretty good praise about it, I would assume. But the developers are like, no, it's non-canonical, it's not a thing, they don't really acknowledge it, and it seems to me that, like, I don't know, it's kind of unfortunate because the improvements that they did, to me at least, were really well done, and yeah, I'm looking forward to playing through Hellfire, and I'm really curious to know sort of like what your experiences was with Diablo, and like did you really enjoy the first one, or are you more of a fan of the second one? Let me know in the comments down below. But yeah, thanks for joining in my retrospective in the original Diablo. It's like I said, a game that I never actually got around to, and I'm excited now that I'm sort of part of the OG Diablo fandom, so to speak, because it was a really fun and entertaining game. Yeah, so we'll see you in the next episode.